Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Libby Lester. I'm Director of the Institute for Social Change and Professor of Media and Communication in the University's College of Arts, Law and Education. And I'm delighted to be chairing this evening's panel discussion. Island of Ideas is a program designed to keep ideas and debate flowing during this period when we were unable to host live public events. Each year, the university presents hundreds of lectures, forums, seminars and workshops for students, alumni and the wider community. We see these as an important part of the university's role, and it's why we're hosting forums such as this one this evening. So a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done by typing them into the Q&A function you'll see on your screens. A section of these will be answered during the Q&A section towards the end of the forum. And finally, the session is being recorded for later access on our YouTube and SoundCloud channels. So a little about the Tasmania Project, which the university began in March, just as Tasmania was entering its state of emergency. The basis for the study was that, as with many things, Tasmania would experience the pandemic in ways different from other places. Its residents and communities would have their own challenges through the crisis and the recovery phase. We're also aware that longer-term questions about future social, economic and cultural policy were going to be asked and directions determined, given the extent of disruption. So the study was established to provide evidence-based and timely information that would be useful to those making both immediate and lasting decisions in government, community sector and business. And to do this in a way so that Tasmanian residents knew that their experiences were, at the very least, being shared through this critical period. So we've now had 5 surveys in the field, 2 general surveys asking how people are faring and about their intentions and opinions regarding Tasmania and its future, and some focus surveys on food access and supply and on housing, and 1 for children and younger people. We've also interviewed almost 100 people seeking to understand their experiences and responses in greater depth. So overall, our number of participants in the study is now about 2,500, covering all areas of the state. 50 plus researchers from across the university are helping analyse and summarise data. And you can find the more than 20 short reports we've produced to date on the Institute for Social Change website. More are going up daily. So thank you to everyone who has contributed so far as a research participant, a researcher or a partner organisation. Tonight's event is very much in the spirit of the Tasmania Project, an opportunity to explore the impacts of COVID-19 through a lens focused squarely on Tasmania and its residents. We have the ideal panel for this. Through their work, each member has been tasked to synthesise and communicate the experiences, attitudes and needs of Tasmania to help guide us through recovery and beyond. Let me introduce them. Professor Rufus Black is the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Tasmania. Previously, he was Master of Ormond College, an Enterprise Professor in the Department of Management and Marketing, and a Principal Fellow in the Department of Philosophy, all at the University of Melbourne. Rufus's private sector experience includes 9 years as a partner at McKinsey and Company, serving clients in Australia and Asia, and as a director for national law firm Cause Chambers Westgarth. His educational and social sector experience includes being the President of Museums Victoria, the Deputy Chancellor of Victoria University, the founding chair of the board of Teach for Australia, a director of the New York-based Teach for All, and the director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. He's worked extensively for government at federal and state levels, conducting the Black Review into the Department of Defence and the Prime Minister's independent review of the Australian intelligence community. He was the strategic advisor to the Secretary of Education in Victoria and a board member of Innovation Science Australia. He was recently appointed to the Tasmanian Premier's Economic and Social Recovery Council. Rufus holds degrees in law, politics, economics, ethics and theology from the University of Melbourne and Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Kim Goods, the principal of 3P Advisory, is recognised as one of the foremost public voices in Tasmania. She has 2 decades of experience working in government and the not-for-profit sector in social and economic public policy fields as diverse as education, employment, transport, energy, digital inclusion, health, housing and human services. She's worked across both the public and private sectors as a sought-after advisor, specialising in public engagement, corporate social responsibility, social licence to operate, and evidence-informed economic and social policy and program responses. While CEO of TasCos, Kim was recognised for her work challenging and changing the systems, behaviours and attitudes that lead to inequality and disadvantage. She's worked as an advocate and lobbyist on a range of policy projects and legislative changes with the objective that every resident of Tasmania has the opportunity to live a good life. Kim is also a director of the Brand Tasmania Board, the chair of the East Coast Tasmania Tourism Board, a state council member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and a director of the board of Wintringham, a unique national aged care provider supporting older Australians who have spent many years homeless and living in poverty. Kim was also recently appointed to the Premier's Economic and Social Recovery Council. Daryl Connelly was appointed as Chief Executive Officer of the Cradle Coast Authority in December 2019 to oversee a period of organisational reform, including a renewed focus on economic development and council collaboration. Prior to that, he was co-founder and executive officer at Switch Tasmania, a not-for-profit established in 2011 to support people with a business or a business idea. He remains on the board. Other committee roles include the Tasmanian Libraries Advisory Board, the RDA Tasmania Committee, the Institute of Public Administration Australia, Tasmania, and the Tasmanian School of Business and Economics, where he is an adjunct senior lecturer, supporting a number of PhD and honours students. Daryl holds a Master of Business from the University of Tasmania and is a graduate of the Tasmanian Leaders Program. So each of our panellists will speak for about 5 minutes or so before we move on to questions. And to get us started, I'll hand over to Rufus. Thank you, Rufus.
Thank you, Libby, and terrific to be joining this conversation tonight. I thought I would start with a broad picture of what I think we are seeing happening at the most macro level. And I'd begin by saying, as we went into this COVID circumstance, Tasmania, in a whole range of ways, had been doing well economically and in some social dimensions, but also had a range of vulnerabilities, which have turned out to be pretty powerful in shaping what's occurred since. While we went into this with a strong economy, we also went into it with some very specific sector dependencies, with young people, with lower attainment rates, with some high levels of casualisation, with clear pockets of regional disadvantage and some ongoing demographic challenges as natural population heads towards natural population decline and a strong dependence on migration. So when the measures necessary to control the virus have come in, and I see them in 2 broad categories, the categories of border controls and the categories of social distancing, each operate to impact our society and economy in related, but also in distinct ways. And I think a way of understanding the kind of flow of economic impact through to social impact is to say that we've seen 2 two broad types of effect. We've seen a broad-based drop in demand right across the economy, which has impacted businesses and in turn employment, and with employment and businesses, of course, the lives of a great many people. And it's been very broad. It's been very broad-based, so the impact has been felt extremely widely. But we've also seen, and this has, I think, been a particular feature of what's happened, is that those structural vulnerabilities have also meant that we've had significant structural impacts, sort of economically and socially, and they've hit particular areas, some of which we have clear information on, some of which we are really only beginning to understand. But as structural impacts, they pose very different set of challenges as we come out of the recovery. We've clearly seen specific sectors hit very hard, and when we think that in just 3 sectors, so in accommodation, food services, arts and recreation, education and training, we've seen 58% of all job losses out of just 3 sectors. We've seen those vulnerabilities hit us really hard. We've seen young people hit really hard with and that's true here. It's true nationally. With almost 38% of the job losses coming in people aged 15 to 24, where they're barely 15% of the workforce. So it's disproportionately hit young people, and of course we're still understanding the impact on children whose education have been disrupted, but we know that's been significant. Casual workers, which has been a feature of the kind of sectors we've had, but also a feature of the Tasmanian economy, have been highly impacted. And we know that people in other categories of disadvantage, often where there are overlaps, are being disproportionately impacted. And all of those things tend to have a regional geographic dimension to them. So we also know that we've got significant areas which are very disproportionately geographically impacted. And I think as we look ahead, we are going to have to deal with the structural impacts economically and socially that flow from those. And as almost all of those areas of impact are ones that will recover, take much longer and recover more slowly, the kind of responses are going to have to move to support those sectors, but also to recognise that in each of them we are needing to deal with some long-term underlying challenges as we come out of this, and that those challenges will need to see significant changes in skills, possibly parts of the economies people work in, and their ability to move between them. So it will in important ways, I think, be a reshaping experience, and the extent to which we come out of it will I think be in part shaped by how seriously we take tackling the original structural issues that have set up these problems that we are going to need to address, or we'll see some very long-term sustained impact on already challenged sectors. So I think there is deep work for us to do as a state. I just note, as a university, we live in the middle of it as a sector that is particularly exposed, and that's because of the role that international students have played in the university's economics. And even while we had pre-COVID been working to move to reduce that dependence, it still finds us at a time where they are a significant contributor. So, like tourism, accommodation, and other sectors, that's a significant impact. And again, it's a multi-year, it's a structural impact. It's something we won't see changing significantly out until 2023-24. So I think when you look at it from the vantage point that we sit in, it gives one a very strong appreciation that we are dealing with structural impacts, and that this is really, we are still in the foothills of the journey we are going to need to be going through, and all of its both social and economic impacts on us. Thanks, Libby.
Rufus, thank you. Kim.
Libby, and I also want to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on tonight, and pay my respects to the Palawa people, and also to acknowledge, excuse me, the ongoing resilience of Tasmanian Aboriginal community. So I just want to probably maybe hone in a little bit on some of the areas that Rufus has just highlighted, and to really think about the ways that we can understand the impact, particularly the social, but obviously the economic impact as well, And to do that, I think it's really important to really step back and have a think about what the social norms of the Tasmanian population are, as a way of really framing where we know then people are really experiencing some of the disruption to their lives that are causing a range of different impacts. So we think what will matter the most to Tasmanians, and we know that this is the case across the state, obviously jobs and economic independence is a critical underpinning of our community and our society. And we know that this has been impacted at an individual level, but, you know, one of the most unique parts of our current scenario is we've had whole households impacted by job loss, which often, you know, sadly we see job loss happen to an individual in the house, but it's very uncommon to see whole households or whole family units impacted quite the way we've currently seen. And that obviously has a flow-on impact into communities and regions and then statewide. Health is sitting very highly in terms of the level of anxiety that people are feeling, in part because, as Rufus has highlighted, we didn't start on a very high base of good health as a state as we entered into this, and our older population and the number of Tasmanians who have one or more chronic conditions is actually the highest in the country. So the exposure that put for us as a state in terms of risk, quite rightfully, was part of the reason why I think we've seen Premier Gutwein so strong in his response, because the risk to our population is very high and it continues to be. What that does, though, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is prolong the anxiety that our population are now feeling for themselves, but also for their family members and the people around them, because there'd be very few Tasmanians who aren't in a family with someone whose either age or health status would put them at a high risk to this virus. So I think the concentrated nature of that in Tasmania is probably higher than we might see in most other parts of the country. Connectedness is a very Tasmanian trait. We are a highly connected island of population. So much so that people joke about our two heads and our degrees of separation being quite small, but equally it underpins the way that we engage and the way that we look after each other in communities, I think, because we are so close and very connected. So that connectedness has been highly compromised by the nature of this virus. That sense of control and certainty that individuals and whole communities or whole industry areas are feeling, a loss of freedom to live the life that we are used to living is also something that's preying on people's minds, and also both individual, community and state aspirations and confidence. And I do just want to touch on that for a moment, because I'm sure that we'll talk about this a little more, Libby, as you ask some questions, but the sort of double-edged sword of where Tasmania was in February versus where we are today is that we were, for the first time in many generations, starting to see aspiration, hope and ability to really achieve some of those steps towards a good life for all Tasmanians. But as part of that, I think a lot of people within the population who were employed and had disposable income were also adjusting their mortgages, their rental levels and their lifestyles accordingly. And so as job losses have hit in places that we wouldn't normally have potentially seen such high levels of job loss, we are seeing people more and more exposed to not just rental stress now, but mortgage stress as well. So mortgage or rental stress being any more than 30% of your income needing to be spent on paying your mortgage or your rent. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we will see emerge in the coming weeks and months is that high level of financial distress. The other area that I just want to touch on to stimulate the thinking and the conversation is the different categories that we are now going to see emerge in terms of employment and unemployment. We do know that during the GFC and also the recession in the early 90s, it partly carried a long tail right through to the current times in terms of people who weren't able to re-engage with work after those two big hits financially and to labour markets. So the risk is quite high that we will see another generation enter longer term unemployment if we cannot be quite strategic and targeted in our responses to that.
Thank you. And over to you, Daryl.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, everybody. So, yeah, firstly, we're on the lands, our Burnie office here is on the lands of the Pleheka Hillapoo people, actually. So I'd like to acknowledge them. And I often reflect on the fact that those people have been looking after our region's environment and trade in our region, certainly well before the Cradle Coast Authority was looking after these things, and well before I was looking after them as CEO of the Cradle Coast Authority. So that is something that I like to acknowledge. Some people wouldn't know that the Cradle Coast Authority is jointly owned by the 9 councils of Western and Northwestern Tasmania to help them achieve regional outcomes and maintain strong local government. And certainly economic development is a new focus of ours. And so I'll be talking mostly through the lens of our economic development work tonight, I suppose. And there are a couple of slides that we've got to set the scene here. We've just done our own small survey to inform our regional recovery efforts, and we've only just started the analysis. But just before I jump into those slides, I just want to talk about some of the other recovery work going on, not because Cradle Coast Authority is at the centre of it, but because I think it does paint a picture of how the region is responding to the impacts of COVID-19. So this survey is just part of our regional restart hub, which we've been working on in conjunction with UTAS and with CPA Australia as well. So the survey is one feature of that, but so is the funding finder, which is a tool that we rapidly all put together so that businesses, clubs, not-for-profits could find the funding and assistance that they need. And it also has a request a mentor feature. And so within moments really of us and UTAS and other partners sitting down and saying, what can we do to help businesses in the region? We had more than 20 professionals from the region. It was in hours, not days, who put their hand up and said, we want to give back to the region. We will make our accounting skills, whatever other skills they have available to small businesses in the region. So that's free mentoring for businesses and clubs that's available now. The other part of our recovery effort is really around ensuring that Battery of the Nation, Project Marinus and other major projects don't lose momentum. You know, it was a really exciting time in the Cradle Coast region when COVID hit. Government priorities are necessarily changing. Industry priorities are changing. So we have an interest in making sure that those projects, where appropriate, don't lose momentum. And that actually coincided with the launch of a new regional investment framework, which was the first time as a region we'd come up with a way of systematically identifying the projects that we could speak up for with one voice as a region. So that's work that's been going on as well. And then the third piece, and again, this is something that we're partnering on with the university, is this concept of reimagining our region. So kind of saying, if we have to rebuild or partially rebuild our regional economy and what society looks like, let's not assume we have to rebuild it as it was before. Let's engage everybody in a conversation about what else our region could be. And so we've kicked off some weekly articles that are a bit thought-provoking, talking about, for example, what if our region could offset the emissions of the rest of the country or the rest of the world? What if we could make our region the factory of the nation? What can we learn from Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is actually funded by Norway's oil and gas reserves, but maybe we can do things here that are funded from renewable energy. And so we've started those articles and we hope to do some public forums in the near future with UTAS. But as I said, one of the first things we did was launch this survey, and we've had 125 businesses respond. And I only want to touch on a couple of the highlights to kind of set the scene. So just on that first slide there, you know, we can see that 28% of the businesses surveyed are expecting long-term financial difficulty. So even though there's a lot of relief in the community at the moment that things are starting to return to normal for many people, businesses are going to be feeling this for a long time. Community groups will be feeling this for a long time. sadly, 14% of them have let staff go and don't expect to rehire them. That's a pretty frightening statistic. I think if, just as we flick through the slides, if we look at the next slide, when you look at accommodation and food service, which is obviously highly represented in the survey, I think also one of the sectors that has been hardest hit, but 37% of those businesses are predicting long-term financial difficulty, and 27% have had to let staff go that they're not expecting to rehire. And as somebody who's worked a lot with small businesses, this isn't just letting people go. Inevitably, many of these people would be the friends of the people that own the business. They would play vital roles in the community, in that business, in their own social circles. So there's still a lot for our region to get through. 26% of the businesses had none of their losses covered by the government funding available, and 33% can't restart at present with the current restrictions still in place. And if we just flick through to the final slide, the things that I wanted to draw your attention to there, I think one of the interesting things, a comment that comes up time and time again, is that the control measures employed by the state government have been excellent. So that was a direct quote, but one of the things that has struck me through all of this is, we do like to bash our politicians, maybe more so in our region than elsewhere, but really I've barely heard a negative word about local government, state government, federal government through this. I think the community has been buoyed by the unification, the unity and the leadership that we've seen. So there's lots more in the survey. We'll actually do a media release later this week and make the full results publicly available, and hopefully that's a useful thing for decision makers.
Daryl, thank you. So look, we'll move straight on to questions. A reminder that you can ask a question by typing them into the Q&A function you'll see on your screens. Maybe a question from me, if that's all right, to get us started. I think, Daryl, some of the issues you were just discussing then around state government restrictions, the level of support for those, for the state government's measures. We've also found a consistently high number of people have supported and complied with state government measures. And picking up on Rufus' question that's come in, that the source of information respondents have most relied on for COVID-19 is the Premier's media briefings, followed quite closely by local and local health authorities. And that few are in a rush to see border restrictions eased. So we have seen an empowering of the notion of the state, and it's not unique to Tasmania by any means, as the polls are showing nationally. But in terms of that federal-state relations, are we seeing something new emerging? And, I'd be interested in all the panellists' thoughts on that.
Yes, I think we are, Libby. It has been interesting to watch, and this shouldn't be about Daryl's opinions on the state of politics, but I think it often takes a crisis to see the best of our political system and to see the best of our political leaders, and we have seen strong leadership and more unity and cooperation than usual, and so I think people respond to that. I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of course, is that crisis, whether it's for a government or whether it's crisis within an organisational reform, it requires a certain kind of management and a certain kind of leadership, and the need for that changes over time. So I think the challenge for any government is to get the timing of that right in terms of when you start to allow some things return to normal, when do you start to allow some of the structures, systems, ways of doing things that were in place before COVID-19 to play their role again. So that'll be a challenge, but I think everybody's been doing it remarkably well so far.
Libby, an observation that I'd make is I think we're really seeing the benefit of a federation. Sometimes people have thought we should be getting rid of levels of government, and there are times when that might make sense. But our ability as a country to be responding to the differing levels of risk we're facing is, I think, proving to be a terrific strength, and we will continue to need it. I mean, I think one of the realities that we are going to have to come to terms with is Victoria is not. This is not a situation that's a kind of one-off. This is actually going to be the new normal. We are going to get outbreaks. And they will need to get, suppressed, and they will require regional action to do it. But the fact that we can respond at kind of state, regional, local levels with differentiated measures, I think will help keep as much of the country as possible closer to normality than in places where you're kind of operating a much more unitary kind of state. So I think this is a strength of the Federation, and I think one of the interesting points of tension is we're recognising that different communities around the country and different states are making different choices about where they're happy to see the risks drawn. And I think the interesting spot will come when there comes to be a tension between where the public think some of these measures should be and where other evidence-based judgments are seeking to kind of locate them. And we're about to enter some interesting territory there as those trade-offs get made. But the Federation is certainly proving to be a strength right now.
Just to add to that with an observation that probably coming into this, we were at a point as a country, but maybe even globally, where trust in government was at an all-time low. There was a range of different research and data that would demonstrate that. And the irony is we then moved into a situation where trust in government was about saving our lives. So I think from both parts of that, from the community, from civil society, from a range of different focused areas, both government and community had to take a deep breath and re-engage in a relationship in a different way to what they might have done in the months and years even leading up to this moment. And that, I think, comes back to that point around, I know both Rufus and Daryl have already mentioned, where we've had some structural fault lines, whether they be in government at any tier of government, and in some of the systems that sit around government. The National Cabinet has probably also given the opportunity for those leaders in our elected leaders in our communities, the opportunity to see when trust really matters and when you need to bypass and leapfrog over particular structures that weren't working. Successful outcomes could be had that were actually life-saving and life-changing in many, many examples. And I think that was a really good incentive for our current elected members at all three tiers of government to take another big step forward on. So I think that will stand us in good stead. And my default position in life is optimism. And I think, there will be some really good things that come from this tragedy. And one of them may be that re-establishment of trusting relationships between government and community.
Okay. So we have a question here from Simon. Are there any areas in which Tasmania has a comparative advantage in coping with and emerging from the COVID health and economic crisis? What are the opportunities that could emerge?
Well, I'm happy to have a perspective on that. And one of them is what it means to be Tasmanian, and that is that we've always had to really do it hard on this island to achieve great things. And where we are sitting currently in terms of the world stage and our brand nationally and internationally, I think we have it within our DNA as a population to go hard again and come out the other side of this. And that's our smaller artisan community that really, as Daryl talked about, the small and medium enterprises who really have set themselves up off pretty much nothing, worked really hard and really put products onto the world stage. I think that is our comparative advantage. And I think that's an important leverage point that we need to make sure we don't overlook as we start to think recovery.
Yeah, building on that, I think the opportunity is to really deepen the sense of what Tasmania is for the world. There are hardly any place in the world that have achieved what we've achieved, and that's a result of kind of remarkable kind of community cohesion and action, and it fits very well with our kind of positioning in the world as a safe, green, clean kind of place. And so if there was ever a thing, it is to double down on the values that really make us distinctive and to be courageous around those, so that this can gel with that picture the world has, so that as we necessarily need to sell some of those terrific things that get created here off the island, we've really done a lot to advance that. And I think the other piece, which is it's almost the social comparative advantages, I think if we can truly tackle some of these, the deeper impacts on the most affected parts of our community, as well as we've tackled the first health wave, we'll build levels of social kind of capability that I think will serve us really well into the future. So a lot hinges for me, Libby, on what we do next.
Daryl?
Yeah, Libby. I was just going to add, Libby, I really do like this concept of factory of the nation. I think some people we have a fantastic manufacturing heritage here in the region, and occasionally people get a bit down in the dumps and say that because of our isolation, that can no longer be competitive, which isn't true. And I think also COVID has got Australians thinking about self-reliance and supply chains a bit differently to how we were thinking about it before. So Tasmania has stacks of raw materials. We have lots of talented people. We've got plenty of clean, renewable and cost-effective energy to turn that into the products that the country needs. And I think just as our isolation helped prevent it, helped shelter us from COVID, it's also true that our isolation is likely to protect us from other kinds of global crises, if you like, whether that's conflict, disease or whatever else. So I think that we can strengthen our manufacturing base here.
One of the interesting things we have found in the survey is about a third of our respondents in our last survey, out of where we had about 1,500 responses, about a third said that COVID was, the experience of COVID was leading them to rethink their life priorities. And this notion of resetting priorities that we're seeing a lot at an individual level, we're also talking about it obviously at a policy level and a state's future. How realistic is that when we're moving, when obviously the first priority is recovery and minimising harm?
I think they can go together, actually, Libby. I think people are making choices about all of a sudden, all sorts of organisations have discovered they can support new forms of flexibility, which means people can balance their lives kind of better. And the amount of change in a few months would often otherwise take years to get that capacity to support people to have those sort of flexibilities. And I think that's probably a great strength for us coming out of it. I think it's brought our attention to things like food security and our need to be tackling that at very local levels, which again are things that I think we can act on and build into new normals. I think it's made us more aware of the vulnerabilities of people around us in the community and the importance of us paying much more attention to those. And again, the drop in volunteering that's happened because of the nature of that, it's made us very aware of how much it's important that we're all contributing in that kind of space, how much it's dependent on. So I think it's made us aware of things that we'll value more coming out of it. It's changed the ways we work, which don't need to go back to those ways. And it's made us pay attention to some important things we want to probably be doing in our community. We realize we can, that again, if we stick with them, could really make a difference.
Yeah, I think a really a really good example of that is when you think about a range of the sort of social challenges and the disadvantage that we've grappled with as a state. One of the things that was really exposed in the first 4 or 5 weeks of people going into isolation was for families who had really struggled to engage with education as parents, them in their own years as students, but also now as parents, and their inability to afford and access strong digital technology. And while there's still a lot of challenges in that space, looking at some really lovely examples coming out of that, where we've got families who have now been able to access digital devices, including quite stable, longer term digital plans rather than buying prepaid data quite frequently. But it's also opened up different relationships for those families with their school, because a lot of schools were really really constructive in engaging early with those families who they knew would really struggle with homeschooling. So I think there are some ways that we could learn from that to see how, again, those relationships, the dynamic of those relationships changed quite significantly during that period, as I understand it from some of the work I'm doing with a couple of organisations at the moment. So I think, you know, while resetting is more challenging when you live in poverty because you don't have many choices, there are also some areas where I think the engagement in learning in the digital world and a desire to address literacy challenges has been highlighted to families in a way that we wouldn't have seen previously.
We have a question here from Sarah. What do each of the panellists think Tasmania's biggest challenge will be as it navigates out of the pandemic? What is unique to Tasmania that will be a challenge?
I think we still, as I said in the introduction, we still carry a long tail of generational unemployment in Tasmania. Some of it still sits there from the recession in the early 90s. Some of it still sits there from the GFC, where some people who lost their job during the global financial crisis actually were never re-engaged in employment. So we do have high levels of generational and long-term unemployed. And it is really critical that we don't have scarring in our labour market that leaves another long-term generation exposed to that. I think that's a really big challenge for us right now as a state, because our existing population, while our unemployment rate had lowered, the number of people participating in the workforce was actually quite low. So I think that's a real challenge for us, but I equally think, as Daryl and Rufus have also highlighted, we have got a lot of natural product, a lot of natural resource and a lot of natural advantage that we could draw down on, but it will mean thinking and reskilling and working quite differently.
I'd really just build on that. I completely agree with Kim. The great challenge is to be finding the next generation of employment for a broader range of Tasmanians. And one of the features, which is a bit hidden by the headline unemployment rate, is we've seen a massive drop in participation in the workforce. So that's true around the country, but it's actually been particularly true in Tasmania, which already had low participation rates. And our piece is to come out of this in better job shape than we went into it. We have way too many casual jobs, and that was a trend that was just continuing to increase. And they were increasingly in lower paying kinds of jobs. So we do need to get very focused on what's the next generation of employment, creating things that fit with who we are as a state, and so that they can leverage off the kind of distinctively Tasmanian things. What is that next generation of high quality Tasmanian branded things that we are making that create jobs for a wide range of people? And there are significant things we could be doing, but we will need to get very focused on those, or there won't be the next generation of jobs for all those people we need to help find a way back into employment.
Yeah, Libby, I'd just like to add a little bit to that. I think whilst people would expect somebody from the Cradle Coast to say this, I think it is important to point out that many of the issues that have already been raised around educational attainment, unemployment, social disadvantage, we can't ignore, shouldn't ignore the fact that those are greater challenges often in many cases in our region. So I think when you overlay that with the fact that our region has in many ways been hit harder than any other part of Australia in terms of COVID-19, we've got to remain focused on that. There has to be a recognition that this region has different challenges ahead, and that it already faced many grave challenges going into this. And so that links back to what I was saying before. State and federal governments have done a fantastic job. At some point in time, we're just going to have to make sure that there's that appropriate local and regional input into those decision-making processes, so that there's nobody's applying a one-size-fits-all approach. And I certainly don't think that's happening. I just think it's something we need to be careful of.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Melinda. How can we use this opportunity to build community? What is happening to make sure the decisions that are being made empower people and build resilience? Interestingly, amongst our findings, the levels of satisfaction are fairly high for Tasmanian residents. One thing that was significantly lower was that people were not feeling a part, not as satisfied in how much they were feeling a part of their local community. Then that was quite a standout. So yes, so Melinda is asking what is happening to make sure the decisions that are being made empower people and build resilience. Daryl, you're on screen. Would you like to have a go at that?
Look, I don't want this to sound like the Cradle Coast Authority show. Again, this all ties together pretty well, but part of the change here at the Cradle Coast Authority has been the implementation of the Futures Plan approach. So it's a complex, ambitious approach to economic development, which really is about getting all of the right people around the table and ultimately involving local people in local economic development decision making. And so that's a great piece of work, which through the goodwill of everybody in the community is going well, and it was going very well just as COVID hit. So again, I think one of the best things we can do is make sure that when we're so focused on dealing with a crisis, we don't lose sight of the good work, the things that we're already working well out there at the local level. There are so many good community groups and other groups out there that are already making sure that locals have input into decision making. And so I think we've just got to be careful not to lose sight of that.
And I think, Libby, it's I mean, from my perspective, we still have a long way to go before we get really place-driven economic and social development as a single task. Government still has not organising around place, and the evidence from places around the world that face not dissimilar challenges to ourselves is that that's a really powerful strategy to go to pursue. But this is where the three levels of government don't join up, and they need to join up around what particular communities' pathways are, because the one-size-fits-all strategies we tend to roll out and then change a little while down the track actually don't often help in local communities in the way they need to, and aren't well tuned to the local complexities that local people know far better than anybody even as distant as a state capital in Tasmania is a long way from the realities of particular communities and exactly what they need. So I do think one of the bigger changes that we need to be heading to is getting coordinated local activity that is lined up with local insights about what their needs are, and that would be a terrific change, and I think a very necessary one.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I think what we've seen, I know that some of the work I've been doing with Lifeline Tasmania, which they're very happy for me to talk about publicly, one of the, they've got a new 1-800 number that the government funded and people can call in. One of the strongest reasons for people ringing is their sense of isolation and their sense of lack of control. And both those things really link back to Melinda's question about how do you give people a voice in an environment where they feel that a lot of what was normal in their life, they've lost control over. And as Rufus mentioned, we've seen a massive decline in people's ability to volunteer because there are health risks in that, etc. So all of those structures that sat within our community that help people stay connected and potentially have a shared voice have temporarily been eroded. So it is a huge priority to ensure we put the structures back in place for those existing groups. But I absolutely agree with Rufus. I don't think we've ever done it in a way that really gives local voice and local leaders the opportunity to drive the change they want to see in their own communities, rather than that real top-down approach. And there's certainly some really great models that we've looked at from around the world in work that I've been involved with, and I know Rufus has, around the inclusive nature of growth and change in communities, and how you give the voice back to communities to take that on. So I think there is an absolute desire from people in communities to do that, but we do need to think about some structures so that we don't assume that we can just walk in and hand that over to communities. We need to be able to engage and really build capacity of people in communities in having that voice.
Thank you. There's a question here from John. Will people start to abandon our larger urban centres?
I think the evidence is that's not very likely. I think the kind of advantages that are still going to accrue to major urban areas will remain very, very strong. I mean, one of the features which is, you know, a great challenge for us, and I think this won't upset that, is, you know, in our globalized world, we're dominated by about 20 major metropolitan areas around the world, which are aggregating an enormous amount of global kind of wealth, capital, talent, very disproportionately. And I don't think any of the forces underlying that are going to fundamentally change coming out of this. This is the interesting thing about all of this, is it's not, it's exaggerating structural challenges we've got. It's not yet fundamentally changing them. And if anything, as it dings globalization a bit, it will probably actually just leave those areas that are advantaged further advantaged. So I'm not sure this is going to end well for kind of regional areas, which risk being poorer, less connected, more disadvantaged, unless we choose to take some different directions, are kind of some of the things we've been talking about tonight.
And I think that comes back to a point Daryl made earlier about people rethinking the resilience within our supply chains globally. And that may be a mechanism locally to try and really think differently about how we invest at a regional level rather than a capital city level. But yeah, I think we've got a challenge ahead of us, that's for sure.
Daryl, have you got anything?
Look, I hope so, Libby. We'll embrace them. We could do with a few extra people, and they'll always be welcome.
Thank you. So a related question from Damien. We've seen our reliance on tourism, specifically in the Cradle coast, with 49 out of 125 businesses responding to Daryl's survey. What do you think these businesses can pivot to now that the international travel market is non-existent? So of course, we should add there that the vast majority of tourists are interstate.
Yeah, that's right, Libby. Thanks. And that's one of the points that I was going to make. So there is no doubt this is a huge blow to our tourism operators, but the point you made is an important one. And you know, we're a resilient, innovative lot up here. I think we'll start to think about how can we refocus on the domestic market, at least in the short and medium term. And I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand as well. I think people from all over Australia, they've long known that this is the best corner of the best island in the world. And as soon as they can travel here, I think lots of people will be keen to travel here. But certainly our tourism industry is going to need a lot of support. And there is a lot of good work being done in that space to support them, both by tourism industry bodies and by local government, and that will continue.
I chair the board of the East Coast Tasmania Regional Tourism Organisation. The East Coast of Tasmania is the 5th most tourism dependent region in Australia. So there is no doubt that it is an absolute tragedy, to be honest, along the coast at the moment. There is some signs of optimism because Tasmanians have really flocked to the East Coast in the last fortnight, and that has been really quite uplifting, I think, for a community that really don't know how they will get through to the point where our borders reopened. And look, the predictions are that we'll be looking at, not just on the East Coast, but across Tasmania, around about 50% of our normal tourism participation for at least a year. And, you know, there is no doubt that we'll have casualties. That is a reality. Regions like the East Coast, the indirect employment into tourism is actually as worrying as the tourism sector itself, because most of the local smaller businesses depend on the tourism dollar coming through for their business to be viable as well. And so I think we're, you know, some of the discussions we've been having, we're still a few months off knowing what that casualty level will look like. But equally, as Daryl's saying, there's a lot of entrepreneurism in the minds and the spirits of people. And, you know, most people who have set up their own small business, which is what the East Coast has a lot of, they did that with blood, sweat and tears, and I think they'll do it again, but there'll be a lot of pain in between.
Rufus, would you like to chip in there at all?
Okay, I think it highlights that it is going to be, I don't know that we'll ever quite see the return to the kind of profile we had, and we kind of have an urgent task to make sure that we are building other sectors of the economy to be enabling people who are coming out of that sector to have good employment close to where they're, you know, close to where they live. So we're going to need to get onto that quickly. And I think once we do recover, even the shape of tourism, it is, you know, for the first while, it is going to be more expensive. It will be more expensive to travel. It will be more complicated in a whole range of ways. So we also need to make sure we're positioned for that part of the market. But essentially, we need to be getting cracking now on supporting people to be migrating to other parts of the economy where it isn't going to be as much employment as we had. And the risk is if we don't do that now, we'll get into the kind of picture Kim was painting of people who are out of work for a very long period of time, and reconnecting to the labour force gets harder with every passing month. So we want to celebrate the tourism industry. It's absolutely fantastic. Will be a vital part of the future, but not quite in the way that it was.
And there's a question here from Anne that leads on from your response, Rufus. It says, I worry about how we ready ourselves as a state to provide assistance to the large number of newly unemployed people when the temporary financial assistance mechanisms are removed by the Australian government. Do we fall back to charities, or are there new models of assistance required?
This really worries me, I've got to say. I'm really worried about what's going to happen when that temporary assistance comes off in those areas I noted as structurally impacted, whether they are places, people, or particular sectors, because that is going to go on for a long time. And we don't have other very, I mean, the normal places are, of course, you know, the kind of welfare system, return to education, which is normally quite a big response in these kind of times. And we need to make sure we're well geared up across the university and TAFE sectors for that. But even with all of those measures, we're in the world of structural adjustment, which is why I want to it's like closing factories. Governments, when big impacts happen on the economy, they recognise you have to sustain kind of serious government support to help those transitions happen. And I think we've got to really be clear that while there's some general effects that impact everyone, we're going to have to support those areas which are structurally impacted to be able to go the journey. This is a long journey, and I don't think we've still got our focus enough around that.
Yeah, a conversation we were having earlier this week really hones in on the fact, and I said, talked about this briefly in the introduction, we're not just seeing individuals here and there losing their jobs. We've got whole families and whole streets of people who are now staring down a period of unemployment. And you know, like we've seen in previous hits, we've got people who are unemployed in their 50s for the first time in their life. They've always been in one job for their whole life. So the range of challenges that sit around that, the risk of blockage in the labour market because there are older people whose superannuation's been impacted. So they'll stay in their jobs for longer, not freeing up that natural flow so that younger people can come through into the labour market. This is a major challenge for us.
There's a question here from Maggie. Just picking up on some of the comments about local place. So organising around place is critical and collective local activity is so essential. But how do we bring the collective voice of community to government?
Yeah, so I think it's a really critical question. I would frame it. You actually have to bring government to the community, and that's the kind of restructure that I think we need to do. It is very hard if it's all got to come to a central government for community voice to have a proportionate impact. If you bring government down to the scale of community, it's a much more direct conversation. And I think we've learned that big scale government. The mechanisms for hearing community are hard, but there's every good reason why we should be, and we can use it. We don't have to restructure the federation. We just have to decide that we want to organise around at community level, and that's the challenge for us. We've got to bring government to people, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is partly why we have to protect where we already have strong community-based structures in place, whether that's through voluntary groups or community groups, natural areas like neighbourhood houses where we can make sure that government can come. And, one of the things that talked about early in this was we can't assume we know, government or anyone else making policy or other decisions, what matters to people. We have to ask people and hear that through their eyes and their experiences, not through assumptions, which, is not intentional, but often unintentionally the consequence of government needing to make, whole of community government decisions.
Yeah, Libby, I think this is where strong local government comes into its own as well. So, instead of the usual council bashing conversations about do we need local government, what does local government do, I think now is a really good time for the people that engage in that commentary to engage the rest of us in, okay, how about we turn the conversation to what do we need of local government as we emerge from COVID-19? Because it is the layer of government that's closest to the people. And I think there are some very good examples right around the state of councils, neighbouring councils working really well together to make sure that they get this piece right. And again, it relates to what I said before about we've got to be careful that we don't just apply top-down approaches. And there is a lot of good work already being done. It just doesn't always get talked about.
Can I just add, Libby, too, one of the least likely places we see government invest currently is community development and understanding the importance of civic leadership, which isn't an elected role. So we talk a bit about government in this discussion, but actually leadership at a community level needs investing in. And I think that how do we build the capability and the opportunity for local people to know how and where and when they can have a voice? That requires a targeted investment, and we haven't seen that happen alongside of some other initiatives, and I think it's very timely that we do.
An important question here from Lynn. Do you think our experiences of COVID-19 and the way its health risks have been represented have influenced the way older people are viewed by the wider community? Will this challenge continuing attempts to change stereotypes of older people?
Well, Libby, I wonder if we might ask you what the Tasmania's kind of project work is telling us about that.
Well, I mean, one of our very earliest revelations, I think, that came out of the Tasmania Project was around COVID safe, that of those people who said they weren't going to download or couldn't download COVID safe app, we realised that the majority of those were significantly older than other people in the community because their devices were older and their access to newer technologies. So precisely the people who were most vulnerable to the community, to the virus, were the ones who would have the least access to that app. And that was for me something of a wake-up call that we hadn't thought of that as a collective group prior. We've also seen, I think, that that a number of people heading towards retirement age or in early sort of reducing down to part-time work have seen a significant drop in hours. So up to about 10 hours a week they've fallen back on average. And that's disproportionately hit the younger group and this older group. I think that some of the issues that we've talked about, what that means for what we're facing in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years' time, we're going to very much see that group hit by both the drop in access to work hours and any impact on superannuation as well that we might experience. So
I think the other thing I'd observe is I think one of the things I think we can probably as a country feel proud of coming out of this is from the very beginning we made it clear there wasn't going to be a choice about who got the scarce medical resources, that we were not going to make choices about not giving them to old people. And that was a really clear, strong statement from the beginning, that our national response would be based on providing for everybody. And I think that was important. That isn't what's happened in every country around the world. There've been very, very different conversations. And I think we've seen when some people have made very, I think, profoundly unethical commentary about letting old people die, that's been kind of responded to extremely strongly by wide sections of the community. So I think we want to build in ensuring that we come out of this valuing people of every age equally. We're good to remind ourselves that we committed as a country to a model of caring for everyone equally. And I think we've got to keep coming back to that. It's very different to what's happened in some places.
So we've got time for one more question that I might ask each of the panellists to address fairly quickly, but it's from Debbie. As our restrictions are lifting and things may return to normal, many of us are yearning for a new normal. What are each of your perspectives on this? And what would your greatest wish be for a new normal for Tasmanians?
Well, I'm happy to have a go at that to start with. I agree. I think that, any, whether it's a crisis or a prolonged period that causes reflection in a society is an opportunity, as much as this has cost lives and has been quite tragic. I have strongly worked in the space of social policy for many years, and I think if I could have a wish list, it would really be to see whether we could tackle what are some of the more wicked social problems of Tasmania through a different approach. That if nothing else, and again, we've had some conversations about this recently, the community have had to change. They've had to pivot. They've had to live their lives quite differently. And I think the test now will be to see how much government can do that. Can government actually think different and respond differently as it's asked its population to? And if it could do that, we could move out of potentially often a crisis management model where we look for food relief, not food security, for example, and we could move to a model that really tries to recognise that we have a broad range of needs in our state that we could be tackling quite differently. It's just a willingness to want to do things differently that may be getting in our way.
Thanks, Kim. Daryl, have you got what would you like to see for the new normal?
Yeah, there's so much, but I want to pick up on one of the points that Kim made earlier, and I think it's really around that leaderful culture. I really think that if we could invest in giving people a voice, in helping people know how they can make a difference. That would do us the world of good in Tasmania. We're sometimes, so many of us who are in positions of influence are sometimes far too apathetic, and I think we take that influence for granted. And so I would really like to see more people having the opportunity to have a positive influence in the decisions that are made.
It's interesting, very shared views here, Libby. This has got to be a story about inclusion and a recognition that we have to bring government much closer to people and to local communities and places where challenges are acute, but equally that they are resourceful and resilient, and that those great Tasmanian qualities that have reinvented parts of this state so many times over have to be supported and cared for and nurtured, so that that extraordinary resilience can actually be the basis of coming out of this rebuilding around the things we choose to care about. I think one of the great, in a sense, one of the good things in this is we've chosen to value some things above others. We've chosen to value health above consumption. A whole group of people have chosen to say food matters in huge ways because we can't have a quarter of our population not having enough food. It's a new, bolder conversation we need. You know, there are a whole set of new conversations we've had, and I think we have to grab those. And I think we also have to be demanding about government responding to those.
Thank you. So time to wrap up. So from the Tasmania Project team's perspective, I think the speakers and audiences' insights and questions have given us much to thinking about in terms of designing the next stage of the study. So please join me, albeit silently, in thanking our panellists, Rufus Black, Daryl Connelly and Kim Goods. So this evening's forum will be available soon as a video and podcast via the Island of Ideas website that's now up on your screens. And the series continues with the upcoming online public lectures and forums also on your screen. I'd encourage you to register for these talks, as the university is very much looking forward to continuing the ideas, debate and discussion for and from Tasmania. So thank you for taking part in this event, and good evening.